China attaches great importance to the growth data of GDP. Every year's policies revolve around GDP. Many people don't understand. What's the use of GDP? What does it have to do with me? Isn't GDP just a boring number that can be piled up by repeatedly digging holes and filling them? If you think so, you are completely wrong. GDP stands for Gross National Product. Although theoretically you can pile up GDP figures by constantly tearing down buildings and building them again or digging holes and filling them, don't forget that if you want to be included in the gross national product, you have to pay taxes. For example, if you dig a hole in front of your own house and charge 1 billion yuan for it, and your neighbor pays you, and then he fills the hole and you pay him another 1 billion yuan, then have you created 20 billion yuan of GDP? Of course not. Even if you play this game at home 10,000 times, the national GDP won't increase by a bit. Even the country won't know that you have played such a boring game at home secretly. If I tell the country, then it will be included in GDP, right? Well, you successfully tell the country. Now the country knows, and then the tax bureau will come. Hello, we heard that you earned 1 billion yuan from digging holes just now. Have you paid taxes? If you haven't paid taxes, we suggest you go to jail. According to China's tax law, for your 1 billion yuan income from digging holes, you first need to pay value-added tax. The tax rate for the construction industry is 10%, recently reduced to 9%. After deducting all costs, you also need to pay 25% income tax. In other words, if you want to create this 1 billion yuan GDP, you first need to pay 900 million yuan in taxes. After paying the taxes, you also need to find nearly 10 billion yuan worth of invoices for costs. Otherwise, the profit part will be taxed at 25% again. If you use the money to fill the hole as a cost, well, pay another round of 9% value-added tax. If you have the mood to play around filling holes, the tax bureau has the mood to accompany you in collecting taxes. Do you think it's easy to forge GDP? You have to pay taxes for that. Many local officials who add a little water to GDP can't stand for a few years before being dragged down by the national tax authorities. If GDP could be easily forged, why would the country even look at this data? Now you have a clear understanding of the concept of GDP in your heart. The rumor that GDP can be fabricated out of thin air by digging holes and filling them can no longer deceive you. But you may ask again, even if GDP is not so easy to forge and can reflect a country's economic strength, what's the value of it? The value is huge. GDP is directly proportional to a country's war potential. Now our GDP has climbed to the second place in the world. What does this represent? Let me take the example of the United States. In 1894, the United States became the world's largest GDP country. Of course, at that time, the United States was still just a rising junior. Although its GDP ranked first, all the most advanced technologies were still in the hands of old capitalist countries such as Britain, France, and Germany. Although the United States had GDP, its technological content was too low and not presentable enough. So during World War I, the United States obediently played the role of a junior partner, selling arms and military supplies to both sides of the war. It only symbolically participated in the war after the war ended. By World War II, although the United States still couldn't catch up with Germany in technology, the gap was already small. Eventually, the United States participated in the war as a main force and finally won the status of the world hegemon. It had been almost 50 years since the United States became the world's largest GDP country. So don't think being the world's largest GDP country is useless. If China becomes the world's largest GDP country, even if high-end and sophisticated technologies are still in the hands of the United States, China also has a great hope of becoming the next world hegemon. What role did the powerful GDP-driven production capacity of the United States play during World War II? In 1940, the German army launched a blitzkrieg. There is an error here. It should be 5 aircraft carriers in the whole United States. Japan sent 6 aircraft carriers to launch a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, trying to sink the 2 American aircraft carriers moored in Pearl Harbor. Unfortunately, the aircraft carriers just happened to be out and avoided a catastrophe. But this doesn't matter. Even if these two aircraft carriers sank, it wouldn't matter. Do you know why? Because after the Pearl Harbor incident, the United States frantically built aircraft carriers. In just 4 years until 1945, the United States built and launched a total of 155 aircraft carriers. This data is simply despairing for Japan. Mom, just blow up, it will. After blowing up, I'll keep building. By the end of World War II in 1945, the United States had 10,759 various types of warships, with more than 120 aircraft carriers alone, and the tonnage of its ships exceeded 18.32 million tons. At that time, the combined naval strength of all countries in the world was no match for that of the US Navy. This is the strength of the world's #1 manufacturing powerhouse. These massive amounts of equipment, coupled with 12 million American soldiers, although the combat effectiveness of the US military was rather poor, they simply overwhelmed Japan and Germany by sheer numbers. Many people say that what you just mentioned is the history of the United States. I've also heard a story about the Qing dynasty. The GDP of the Qing dynasty was also very high, but it was no match at all. This is enough to show that GDP is useless. This story is indeed quite well known, but you only heard one side of it and not the other. The First Sino-Japanese War broke out in 1894, which was also the year when the United States had the highest GDP, not China. At that time, China didn't even have an institution to calculate GDP. The so-called GDP is all estimated by people afterwards. So, if we calculate GDP by fiscal revenue, this is a more reasonable way and can reflect the real GDP situation. For example, in 2018, the US fiscal revenue was $6.439 trillion, accounting for 31.4% of the national GDP, while China's total fiscal revenue was 25.87 trillion yuan, accounting for 28.74% of the national GDP. China's fiscal revenue converted into US dollars was 3.86 trillion, and the gap in fiscal revenue between China and the US, as well as the gap in GDP, almost coincided. The proportion of revenue to GDP in both countries was also almost the same. This is enough to prove that China's GDP is real. So, what was the fiscal revenue of the Qing dynasty during the First Sino-Japanese War? In the 1890s, the fiscal revenue of the Qing dynasty was 80 to 90 million taels of silver, which was approximately equivalent to 500 to 600 million francs or 30 million pounds. At that time, France's fiscal revenue was 3 billion francs, 5 to 6 times that of the Qing dynasty. Britain's fiscal revenue exceeded 100 million pounds, 3 to 4 times that of the Qing dynasty. And Japan's fiscal revenue was 150 million yen, equivalent to 80 to 90 million taels of silver, about the same as that of the Qing dynasty. This was the real GDP of the Qing dynasty. Not to mention, compared with the United States, there was a several-fold gap even compared with Britain and France. At most, it was similar to Japan. Then why did the Qing dynasty lose to Japan in the First Sino-Japanese War? The reason is extreme corruption. When national strength is similar, corruption becomes a fatal flaw. For the Sino-Japanese War, in 1894, Japan issued war bonds and raised 250 million yen in military funds domestically. After the First Sino-Japanese War, only 200 million yen was spent, leaving a surplus. In contrast, the military funds raised by China were less than half of Japan's and were all exhausted. Among them, 58% were borrowed from foreign loans rather than raised domestically. Warships were also sunk by Japan, and the Qing government had no strength to continue the war. This was the fundamental reason for the Qing dynasty's defeat. With such a comparison of data, it's no wonder that the Qing dynasty lost. Some people say that GDP is just having money, and all these are just fatty tissues. Manufacturing is the muscle. In fact, although China's total GDP is not yet the highest in the world, its manufacturing output has long been the highest. Manufacturing accounts for 36.9% of China's GDP, while it only accounts for 12.4% in the United States. Although the US GDP is higher than that of China, its manufacturing capacity is actually not as good as China's. China's manufacturing output value not only exceeds that of the United States, but is almost equal to the sum of those of the US, Japan, and Germany. As for China's technology, it is indeed inferior to that of the United States, and it may still be inferior in the next few decades. The United States first climbed to the top of GDP in 1894. But during World War II, all the most advanced military equipment came from Germany. After the United States won the war, it immediately seized German talents to strengthen its scientific research capabilities, and finally became the world's #1 scientific and technological power. This shows that a backward country may have strong GDP but weak technology during the process of catching up, and becoming the #1 in GDP does not necessarily mean becoming the #1 powerful country, but if you can't even reach the top in GDP, you definitely can't reach the top. GDP is not everything, but without GDP, nothing can be done. Does having a population mean having GDP? Many people attribute China's success to the demographic dividend, believing that China has developed so fast because it has a large population and its people were poor enough to be exploited for their sweat and blood. This statement is actually very wrong. A simple counterexample is India. India has a similar population to China and a very humorous geographical environment. More importantly, it had a good foundation. When the British left India, they left a very solid industrial foundation for it. The infrastructure maniac China had less railway mileage than India until 1994. Yes, that India that you guys always laugh at with Indians hanging on the roofs of trucks. Before 1994, China's railway. India's transport capacity is even inferior to that of India. I wonder who was laughing at whom back then. That's why Western economists have always been highly optimistic about India, believing that India is the hope of Asia and hyping up the so-called dragon-elephant rivalry with the dragon representing China and the elephant representing India. However, India has now become a laughingstock. It doesn't even have the energy to compete with China, let alone suppress it. Whether in terms of GDP per capita income, the completeness of the industrial system, or the advancement of technology, China completely outperforms India. India also has a population of over 1 billion, but it has degenerated from the hope of Asia into a laughingstock. Chinese people do admire the lives of Americans, but I guess very few would envy the lives of Indians. But before 1994, China's economy was indeed inferior to that of India. Now China has become the Northern Xiao Feng, a powerful and highly skilled character in a famous martial arts novel, while India is just the Southern Murong, a character in the same novel, who only appears powerful, but is actually mediocre. So, having a large population doesn't necessarily mean having a high GDP. Even China's phased-out backward production capacity is not something that India can easily take on. Does India have a supporting industrial chain? Does it have mature infrastructure? Are there skilled industrial workers and an ample supply of high-quality talents? There are many things that China can do, but other countries may not be able to. The war potential brought by China's strong GDP far exceeds your imagination.